The morning mist clung to the Douglas firs like a shroud, transforming the familiar trails of Olympic National Park into something otherworldly. It was August 15th, 1998, and 12-year-old Danny Morrison had been awake since dawn, his small frame pressed against the cabin window, watching the fog roll through the valleys below. The Washington wilderness stretched endlessly before him, a tapestry of emerald green that seemed to breathe with its own ancient rhythm. Danny's fingers traced patterns on the glass as he waited for his father to finish loading the truck. This was their third year coming to the same rustic cabin near Lake Crescent, a tradition that had become sacred to both father and son after Danny's mother passed away 2 years earlier. The grief had carved deep lines around his father's eyes, but out here, among the towering cedars and the whisper of wind through old-growth forests, something in both of them seemed to heal. "Ready, kiddo?" Tom Morrison called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness that had become his default since the accident. He emerged with 2 thermoses of hot chocolate and a backpack stuffed with sandwiches, his weathered hands betraying the nervousness he tried to hide. Tom was a meticulous man, an accountant by trade, who found comfort in planning every detail of their hiking expeditions. Today's route would take them along the Merrymere Falls Trail, a moderate 4-mile loop that Danny had conquered easily the previous summer. Danny nodded eagerly, shouldering his own small backpack, a forest green JanSport that his mother had bought him for his 10th birthday. Inside he carried his most precious possessions, a compass that had belonged to his grandfather, a field guide to Pacific Northwest wildlife, 3 granola bars, and a small notebook where he recorded every animal sighting, every unusual rock formation, every moment of wonder that the forest provided. His mother had encouraged this habit, telling him that the forest held secrets for those patient enough to listen. The drive to the trailhead took 20 minutes along winding roads that carved through walls of timber. Danny pressed his face to the passenger window, watching for the flash of deer or the shadow of a black bear moving through the undergrowth. The radio played softly, classic rock that his father hummed along to, while the morning sun struggled to penetrate the canopy above. There was something different about this morning, though neither father nor son could name it. The forest seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. At the trailhead, Tom checked his watch. 8:30 a.m. Perfect timing. They would reach the falls by noon, have lunch, and be back at the cabin by late afternoon. He went through his mental checklist: first aid kit, emergency whistle, extra batteries for the flashlight, water purification tablets. Tom had become obsessive about safety since losing his wife, as if careful preparation could somehow shield him from further loss. Danny bounced on his toes, impatient to begin. The trail called to him with an urgency he couldn't explain. He had dreamed about the forest the night before, vivid dreams of hidden paths and voices calling his name through the trees. In his dream, he had followed the voices deeper and deeper into the wilderness, until he found himself in a clearing he had never seen before, surrounded by stones arranged in perfect circles. "Dad, can we go now?" Danny asked, adjusting the straps of his backpack. The green fabric was already familiar with forest adventures, bearing small tears from blackberry thorns and faint stains from creek crossings. His hiking boots, broken in over 2 summers of exploration, felt like natural extensions of his feet. Tom smiled, the first genuine smile Danny had seen from him in weeks. "Lead the way, explorer." They started down the trail, their footsteps muffled by years of fallen needles and decomposing leaves. The forest embraced them immediately, its cathedral-like atmosphere inspiring an almost reverent silence. Ancient trees rose around them like living pillars, their bark scarred by centuries of storms and seasons. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a mosaic of light and shadow that shifted with every breath of wind. Danny walked ahead, his young eyes scanning the forest floor for treasures. He paused frequently to examine unusual fungi, to trace the path of beetle tunnels in rotting logs, to listen for the distinctive calls of Stella's jays echoing through the branches. His notebook came out regularly, and he sketched quick observations in the margins. Banana slug, 6 inches long, bright yellow, and woodpecker holes in dead snag, probably pileated. The trail began to climb steadily, winding through groves of western red cedar and hemlock. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation, carrying the scent of moss and fern and the distant promise of snow-fed streams. Danny's excitement was infectious, and Tom found himself relaxing for the first time in months. Out here, away from the constant reminders of his wife's absence, he could almost pretend that their family was still whole. They had been hiking for about an hour when Danny stopped abruptly. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked to one side, listening to something only he could hear. The forest around them seemed to pulse with an energy that raised the hair on the back of Tom's neck. "What is it, son?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Danny shook his head slowly, his eyes focused on something beyond the visible trail. "I thought I heard... Never mind. It was probably just a bird." But Tom noticed that Danny's hand had gone instinctively to the compass in his pocket, his mother's gift that he treated like a talisman. The boy's face wore an expression of intense concentration, as if he were solving a puzzle that existed just beyond the edge of understanding. They continued hiking, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The forest seemed to be watching them, waiting for something. Danny's pace quickened, and Tom found himself struggling to keep up with his son's sudden urgency. The trail stretched ahead of them, disappearing around a bend marked by a massive cedar that had probably been standing when the first European explorers reached these shores. As they rounded that bend, Danny paused again. This time he turned to look back at his father with eyes that seemed older than his 12 years. The morning light caught the auburn highlights in his hair, making him look almost ethereal against the dark backdrop of the forest. "Dad," he said quietly, "do you think Mom can see us when we're out here?" The question caught Tom off guard, striking him in the chest with the force of unexpected grief. He had been so focused on moving forward, on keeping busy, on maintaining the routines that gave their lives structure, that he had avoided talking about the deeper questions that haunted them both. "I think," Tom said carefully, "that she loved these woods as much as we do, and I think that love doesn't just disappear." Danny nodded solemnly, as if his father's words had confirmed something he already knew. He turned back to the trail, but there was a new determination in his posture, a sense of purpose that seemed to pull him forward like a compass needle seeking true north. They walked in comfortable silence for another half hour, the sound of rushing water gradually growing louder ahead of them. Marymere Falls was close now, its 60-foot cascade hidden just beyond the next rise. Danny's excitement returned, and he began to jog ahead, his small form darting between the trees with the confidence of a child who had made this journey before. "Stay where I can see you," Tom called out, but his voice was swallowed by the forest. Danny had already disappeared around the next bend, his forest-green backpack the last thing visible before the trail curved out of sight. Tom quickened his pace, annoyed with himself for letting Danny get so far ahead. The sound of the falls grew louder, a constant roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The trail here was well maintained, carved into the hillside with wooden steps and handrails, but Tom's anxiety spiked as he realized he couldn't see his son anywhere ahead. "Danny!" he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Danny, where are you?" The only answer was the thunder of falling water and the whisper of wind through the trees. Tom began to run, his heart pounding with a fear that tasted like copper in his mouth. The trail opened up ahead, revealing the spectacular cascade of Marymere Falls plunging into a crystal-clear pool surrounded by moss-covered rocks and ancient stumps. But Danny was nowhere to be seen. Tom stood at the viewing platform, his eyes scanning every visible inch of the area. The falls roared before him, indifferent to his growing panic. He called Danny's name again and again, until his voice was hoarse and the sound seemed to mock him as it bounced off the canyon walls. If this story moved you in any way, you might want to subscribe to hear what happens next. The forest kept its secrets, and somewhere in its depths, a 12-year-old boy with a green backpack had vanished as completely as morning mist touched by the sun. The Olympic National Park headquarters buzzed with an energy that bordered on controlled chaos. Within 4 hours of Tom Morrison's frantic call to 911, the building had transformed into a command center that hummed with the urgent efficiency of a search and rescue operation. Maps covered every available surface, marked with grid patterns and elevation lines that divided the vast wilderness into manageable search zones. The scent of strong coffee mixed with the metallic smell of radio equipment and the underlying tension that accompanied every parent's worst nightmare. Tom sat in a plastic chair beside the main desk, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His eyes were red-rimmed and unfocused, staring at nothing while his mind replayed the morning's events in an endless loop. Every few minutes he would stand up and pace to the window, looking out at the forest as if he could will Danny to emerge from the tree line through sheer force of paternal love. Ranger Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old with 15 years of wilderness experience despite her young age, had taken point on the search coordination. She had grown up in these mountains, knew every trail and creek crossing, every hidden ravine where a lost child might seek shelter. Her calm demeanor and methodical approach had earned her the respect of the volunteer search teams, but privately, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety that came with every missing person case. "We've got 6 teams deployed," she reported to Tom, her voice steady and professional. "Team Alpha is working the main trail system from Merrymere Falls back to the trailhead. Team Beta is checking all the secondary paths that branch off from the main route. Teams Gamma and Delta are working the creek beds and ravines. Kids sometimes follow water when they're lost." Tom nodded mechanically, processing the information without really hearing it. His mind was stuck on that moment when Danny had disappeared around the bend, the casual way he had called out for his son to stay in sight. If only he had insisted Danny wait for him. If only he had been more careful. If only he had never let them come to this place at all. The search teams were a mixture of park rangers, local volunteers, and members of the King County Search and Rescue Unit. They moved through the forest with the methodical precision of people who understood that time was both their greatest ally and their most dangerous enemy. In the first 24 hours, a lost child could usually be found within a reasonable distance of where they had last been seen. After that, the search radius expanded exponentially, and the statistics became increasingly grim. Dr. Michael Reeves, a child psychologist who consulted on missing persons cases, had driven up from Seattle to assist with the search strategy. He sat across from Tom, his notebook open, asking gentle questions designed to build a psychological profile of Danny that might predict his behavior in the wilderness. "Tell me about Danny's personality," Dr. Reeves said, his voice soft but insistent. "Is he impulsive? Cautious? Does he have any favorite places he likes to hide when he's upset?" Tom struggled to focus on the questions. He's curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to explore. But he's not reckless. His mother taught him to be careful in the woods, to pay attention to his surroundings. His voice broke slightly on the word mother, and he had to pause to collect himself. "Has he ever gotten lost before? Even briefly?" "No, never. He's got a good sense of direction. He carries his grandfather's compass everywhere, knows how to use it. He's been hiking these trails for 3 years." Tom's hands clenched into fists. "That's what I don't understand. He knows these woods. He knows better than to wander off the trail." The search continued through the night, powerful spotlights sweeping through the forest while teams called Danny's name in coordinated patterns. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the immensity of the wilderness. Tom walked with one of the search teams, his voice growing hoarse from calling his son's name, but he refused to rest. Every minute that passed felt like a betrayal of Danny's trust. By morning, the search had expanded to cover a 10-square-mile area. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors chopping through the air with mechanical precision, while search dogs worked the ground with their handlers. The dogs had picked up Danny's scent on the main trail, confirming that he had indeed reached the falls area. But after that, the trail went cold. It was as if the boy had simply vanished into thin air. Local news crews began arriving on the second day, their satellite trucks and camera equipment creating a media circus that made Tom's stomach turn. He watched from the command center as reporters practiced their stand-ups in front of the forest, their voices carrying the practiced gravity of people who made their living from other people's tragedies. The story was already being shaped into the familiar narrative of a missing child, complete with school photos and interviews with neighbors who described Danny as a good kid and always smiling. The search teams worked in shifts, combing through every ravine, every deadfall, every place where a 12-year-old boy might have fallen or sought shelter. They found traces of other hikers, lost water bottles, candy wrappers, the occasional piece of clothing, but nothing that belonged to Danny. The forest seemed to have absorbed him completely, leaving no trace of his passage. On the third day, the search expanded again. The Coast Guard deployed boats on Lake Crescent, dragging the deeper sections with sonar equipment, while divers searched the shallower areas near the shore. Tom watched from the dock as they brought up debris from the lake bottom, old fishing tackle, a bicycle tire, pieces of rotting wood, but nothing that offered any clue to his son's whereabouts. The volunteers began to show signs of fatigue. These were people who had dropped everything to help search for a missing child, taking time off work, leaving their own families to comb through miles of wilderness. Their dedication was humbling, but Tom could see the doubt creeping into their eyes. After 72 hours, the chances of finding Danny alive were diminishing rapidly. Ranger Chen called a meeting on the fourth day to reassess the search strategy. The assembled team looked exhausted, their faces drawn with the kind of weariness that came from hope repeatedly deferred. Maps covered the table, marked with different colored pins, representing areas searched, areas still to be covered, and areas where searches had been repeated multiple times. "We've covered approximately 40 square miles, Chen reported, her voice betraying the first signs of strain. "We've deployed dogs, helicopters, ground teams, and water search units. We've checked every trail, every creek, every known camping spot within a 15-mile radius of the last confirmed sighting." Tom felt something cold settle in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to consider the possibility that Danny left the immediate area, either on his own or—" She paused, unwilling to voice the alternatives that everyone was thinking. "We're going to expand the search to include the possibility that he may have encountered someone, that this might not be a simple case of getting lost." The FBI had already been notified, their child abduction specialists reviewing the case file and preparing to take a more active role in the investigation. The statistics were stark. Children who disappeared in wilderness areas were usually found within the first 48 hours, either alive or dead. Those who remained missing after a week had likely encountered something other than the natural dangers of the forest. Tom's world began to collapse in slow motion. The search teams continued their work, but he could see the change in their body language, the way they went through the motions with less urgency, less hope. The media attention intensified, with reporters asking increasingly intrusive questions about Tom's personal life, his relationship with his son, his whereabouts at the time of the disappearance. Dr. Reeves spent hours with Tom, helping him process the psychological impact of the unknown. "The not knowing is often harder than knowing," he explained. "The mind creates scenarios, fills in the blanks with fears and possibilities. It's natural, but it's also destructive. You have to focus on what you can control, not what you can't." But Tom found it impossible to focus on anything beyond the simple, terrible fact that his son was gone. The cabin they had rented sat empty, Danny's belongings still scattered around the small bedroom, as if he might return at any moment. Tom couldn't bring himself to pack them up, couldn't accept that their annual tradition might be over forever. As the first week ended, the official search was scaled back to a maintenance level. The volunteers returned to their normal lives, the media moved on to other stories, and the forest settled back into its ancient rhythm. But Tom remained, haunting the trails like a ghost, carrying pictures of Danny, and asking every hiker, every ranger, every person he encountered if they had seen a 12-year-old boy with a green backpack. The forest kept its secrets, and somewhere in its depths the truth about Danny Morrison's disappearance waited patiently for someone persistent enough to find it. 5 years had passed since Danny Morrison vanished into the Olympic forest, and the missing person case had settled into that peculiar limbo reserved for mysteries that refused to resolve themselves. The official search had been suspended after 6 months, though it was never formally closed. Danny's case file sat in a metal cabinet at the park headquarters, growing thicker each year with reported sightings that led nowhere, tips from psychics and well-meaning strangers, and the occasional piece of debris that rangers hoped might provide a clue. Tom Morrison had aged a decade in those 5 years. His hair, once dark brown with only hints of silver, had gone completely grey. Deep lines bracketed his eyes and mouth, etched by sleepless nights and the constant weight of unanswered questions. He had moved to Port Angeles, a small city just outside the Olympic Peninsula, unable to return to his old life in Seattle, but unwilling to leave the area where his son had disappeared. The accounting firm where he had worked for 15 years had been understanding at first, granting him extended leave and offering support through their employee assistance program. But grief, Tom discovered, had its own timeline that rarely aligned with the expectations of the working world. He had tried to return to his old job, but found himself unable to concentrate on spreadsheets and tax forms when his mind was constantly wandering to forest trails and unanswered questions. Now he worked part-time at a small bookstore in Port Angeles, a job that paid barely enough to cover his modest apartment, but offered the flexibility he needed to continue his own search efforts. Every weekend, and sometimes during the week, he would drive to the Olympic National Park and walk the trails with a methodical persistence that had become his new religion. He carried laminated photos of Danny, his contact information, and a growing collection of maps marked with his own system of symbols and notations. The rangers had come to know Tom well over the years. Some viewed him with sympathy, others with a mixture of pity and concern. Ranger Chen, now a supervisor with graying temples of her own, still took his calls and listened patiently to his theories about new areas to search or patterns he thought he had discovered in the terrain. She had learned to balance compassion with the practical reality that the Park Service couldn't dedicate unlimited resources to a single missing person case, no matter how heartbreaking. "Tom," she would say gently, "we've searched that area dozens of times. The volunteers have covered every square foot of those trails. If there was something to find, we would have found it by now." But Tom couldn't accept that logic. He had become a student of the forest, learning its seasonal rhythms, its hidden ravines, its forgotten logging roads that appeared on no current map. He had read everything he could find about children who had gone missing in wilderness areas, studying their cases for patterns that might apply to Danny's situation. He had contacted other families who had lost children in similar circumstances, forming a loose network of people united by their refusal to give up hope. The psychological toll was evident to anyone who knew him. Dr. Reeves, who had continued to check in on Tom over the years, worried about his client's increasing isolation and obsessive focus on the search. "Grief is a process," he would remind Tom during their sessions, "but it's supposed to be a process that moves forward. You're stuck in the bargaining stage, trying to negotiate with the universe to bring Danny back." Tom's relationship with his extended family had strained under the weight of his obsession. His brother in California had stopped calling after Tom missed their father's funeral, unable to leave the peninsula during what he believed might be a critical period in his search. His sister in Chicago had tried to convince him to move closer to family, to start rebuilding his life, but Tom couldn't make her understand that leaving felt like abandoning Danny. The media attention had faded quickly, as it always did. Danny's case had been featured on a few television shows about missing children, generating brief flurries of tips and supposed sightings, but nothing that led to actual evidence. Tom had appeared on these shows, his desperation making him appear hollow-eyed and obsessed, probably doing more harm than good for his cause. The producers were sympathetic, but ultimately moved on to newer cases, fresher tragedies that would hold viewers' attention. Yet Tom persisted. He had developed his own theories about what might have happened to Danny, scenarios that he refined and adjusted based on his growing knowledge of the forest. Maybe Danny had fallen into one of the old mine shafts that dotted the area, abandoned excavations from the early logging days that weren't marked on any current maps. Maybe he had encountered someone with bad intentions, someone who had taken him far from the search area before the authorities could respond. Maybe he had simply gotten lost and found shelter in some hidden cave or abandoned cabin, surviving longer than anyone thought possible. The most painful theory, and the one that Tom returned to most often, was that Danny had simply kept walking, that his son, confused and frightened, had followed some internal compass deeper into the wilderness, always staying just ahead of the search teams, always believing that the next ridge or the next valley would lead him home. In this scenario, Danny had become part of the forest itself, his small body eventually claimed by the cycles of nature that governed these ancient woods. Tom's apartment reflected his obsession. The walls were covered with topographical maps, marked with different colored pins representing areas searched, areas still to be explored, and locations where supposed sightings had been reported. Boxes of case files, newspaper clippings, and correspondence with other families filled every available space. His computer contained hundreds of hours of video footage from search helicopters, satellite imagery, that he studied for any anomaly that might indicate human presence, and correspondence with amateur investigators who had taken an interest in Danny's case. The other residents of his apartment building had learned to avoid him. They knew about his missing son, had heard him on the phone at all hours coordinating with search volunteers, or arguing with park officials about access to restricted areas. They saw him leaving before dawn, with his backpack and hiking boots, returning after dark with dirt on his clothes and exhaustion in his eyes. He had become a ghost haunting his own life, present but not really living. On the 5th anniversary of Danny's disappearance, Tom organized a memorial hike that drew about 30 people. They walked the same trail where Danny had vanished, stopping at the falls to hold a moment of silence. Local news covered the event, interviewing Tom about his continuing search efforts and his refusal to give up hope. He spoke about keeping Danny's memory alive, about the importance of never stop looking, but his words carried the hollow ring of someone who had said them too many times. After the memorial, Tom found himself alone at the falls as the sun began to set. The other participants had gone home to their families, their normal lives, their problems that had solutions. He stood on the viewing platform where he had last seen his son, watching the water cascade into the pool below, with the same indifferent power it had possessed 5 years ago. The forest around him was changing with the seasons, preparing for another winter, another cycle of death and renewal. Somewhere in its depths, the truth about Danny Morrison waited patiently, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves and the slow accumulation of years. The search would continue, Tom knew, until either he found his son or the forest finally claimed him too. But on this anniversary evening, as the darkness gathered around him like a familiar friend, Tom allowed himself a moment of doubt. What if Dr. Reeves was right? What if he was wasting his life chasing a ghost? What if the kindest thing he could do for Danny's memory was to finally let him rest? The thought lasted only a moment, before Tom pushed it away. He couldn't give up. Not yet. Not while there were still areas to search, still questions to ask, still hope to sustain him through another year of not knowing. He shouldered his backpack and began the walk back to his truck, his footsteps echoing in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow, he would begin again. 10 years after Danny Morrison disappeared, the case had achieved a kind of mythical status among the rangers and regular visitors to Olympic National Park. It had become one of those stories that people told around campfires, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the wilderness and the way the forest could swallow a person without a trace. New rangers learned about it during their training, not as an active case, but as a reminder of the importance of safety protocols and the limits of human knowledge in the face of nature's vastness. Tom Morrison had become a fixture in the park, as much a part of the landscape as the ancient trees and weathered rocks. His persistence had worn down the initial resistance of park officials who had come to accept his presence as a fact of life. He had earned a grudging respect from the more experienced rangers, who recognized in him a kind of expertise that came from years of obsessive study. He knew the terrain better than anyone, had walked more miles of trail than most people who worked there professionally. His methodology had evolved over the years. Where once he had searched with the desperate energy of a man racing against time, he now moved with the patience of someone who understood that his quest might take the rest of his life. He had divided the park into sectors, keeping meticulous records of where he had been and what he had found. His maps were works of art in their own right, covered with symbols and notations that represented a decade of accumulated knowledge. The search had also attracted a small but dedicated group of volunteers who had been drawn to Tom's cause over the years. They called themselves Danny's Rangers, though they had no official connection to the Park Service. Most were retired people who had the time and inclination to spend weekends combing through remote areas of the forest. Others were parents who had found in Tom's search a way to confront their own fears about losing a child. A few were simply people who believed that everyone deserved to be found, no matter how long it took. Margaret Chen, who had been Sarah Chen before her marriage to a fellow ranger, had been promoted to district supervisor, but still took a personal interest in Tom's case. She had watched him transform from a desperate father into something approaching a folk hero, and she worried about the toll his obsession was taking on his physical and mental health. At 62, Tom showed signs of the hard living that came with spending most of his time outdoors. His face was permanently weathered, his hands scarred from years of pushing through underbrush and scrambling over rocks. "Tom," she said during one of their regular meetings, "you know we've covered this area dozens of times. What makes you think this time will be different?" Tom spread his latest map across her desk, pointing to a series of notations that meant nothing to anyone but him. "I've been studying the soil composition reports from the Geological Survey. There's a limestone substrate in this area that could indicate cave systems that aren't on any of the standard maps." Danny was fascinated by caves. If he found an entrance, he might have gone in to explore. Margaret nodded patiently. She had heard variations of this theory before, along with dozens of others that Tom had developed over the years. Each new hypothesis was supported by research that would have impressed a graduate student. But none had led to any actual evidence. Still, she had learned not to dismiss Tom's ideas entirely. His obsession had made him genuinely knowledgeable about the forest, and occasionally his insights proved useful for other purposes. The cave theory had particular appeal because it addressed one of the most puzzling aspects of Danny's disappearance: the complete absence of any trace evidence. Search dogs had lost his scent at the falls, helicopters had spotted nothing from above, and ground teams had found no clothing, no personal items, no signs of struggle or distress. If Danny had fallen into a cave system, it would explain why he had vanished so completely. Tom had spent months researching the geology of the Olympic Peninsula, learning about the limestone formations that could support cave development. He had contacted speleologists, cavers who specialized in exploring underground systems and had convinced several of them to join his search efforts. They had found caves, small ones mostly, but none that showed any sign of human presence. The Danny's Rangers had grown to include about 15 regular volunteers, with others who joined occasionally for specific search efforts. They met monthly at a community center in Port Angeles, planning their next excursions and sharing information about areas they had covered. Tom had become their unofficial leader, though he was careful to emphasize that anyone could pursue their own theories about where Danny might be found. Among the regulars was Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a retired anthropologist who had become fascinated by the case after meeting Tom at a coffee shop in town. She brought a scientific approach to the search that complemented Tom's intuitive understanding of the forest. Dr. Hendricks had organized several searches based on behavioral analysis, trying to predict where a 12-year-old boy might have gone if he had become separated from his father. Children who get lost often follow linear features, she explained during one of their meetings. They follow creek beds, ridgelines, or animal trails because these provide a sense of direction and purpose. Danny was an intelligent boy who had hiking experience. He wouldn't have just wandered randomly through the forest. Another regular was James Whitehorse, a member of the lower Elwha Klallam tribe who had grown up on the peninsula and knew the area's history better than anyone. He had shared stories about traditional hunting grounds and seasonal camps that might have offered shelter to a lost child. His knowledge of the forest included details that weren't recorded in any official documents: old trails that had been used for generations, hidden springs that might have provided water, and natural shelters that could protect someone from the elements. The search efforts had evolved to include new technologies that hadn't been available in 1998. Ground-penetrating radar had been used to scan areas where Danny might have fallen and been covered by debris. Drone cameras provided aerial surveillance of areas that were difficult to access on foot. Satellite imagery was analyzed for any anomalies that might indicate human presence, though the dense forest canopy made this approach less effective than it might have been in other terrain. Tom had also embraced social media as a tool for keeping Danny's case in the public eye. He maintained a Facebook page and a website that documented his search efforts, sharing photos and updates that reached hundreds of followers around the world. The online community had generated its own theories and occasionally provided tips about areas to search, though none had proven fruitful. The psychological toll of the decade-long search was evident in Tom's increasingly fragmented relationship with the world outside the forest. He had difficulty maintaining friendships with people who didn't understand his obsession. He had tried dating a few times, but found it impossible to connect with anyone who wasn't willing to make Danny's case a central part of their life. His health had suffered from years of irregular eating and sleeping, and his finances were precarious despite the small income from his bookstore job. Dr. Reeves had continued to work with Tom, though their sessions had become less frequent as Tom became more resistant to any suggestion that he might need to modify his approach. "You're living in a state of suspended animation," the psychologist had told him during their last meeting. "You've put your entire life on hold for a possibility that becomes less likely with each passing year." But Tom couldn't accept that logic. He had seen too many cases of people who had been found after years of being missing, had read too many stories about remains being discovered decades after someone had vanished. He knew that the forest kept its secrets for a long time, and that persistence was often the only difference between mystery and resolution. On the 10th anniversary of Danny's disappearance, Tom organized another memorial hike, but this time the turnout was smaller. The initial wave of public interest had long since faded, and many of the original supporters had moved on to other causes. Still, about 20 people made the walk to Merrymere Falls, including several of Danny's rangers and a few reporters who were working on retrospective articles about the case. Tom stood at the viewing platform where he had last seen his son, looking out over the falls with eyes that had seen too much and found too little. The forest around him was the same and different. Trees had grown, storms had brought down others, and the endless cycle of decay and renewal had continued without regard for human grief or hope. "I know you're out there," he said quietly, his words swallowed by the sound of falling water. "I know you're waiting for me to find you. I won't give up, I promise." The forest kept its secrets, but Tom Morrison had learned to speak its language. Somewhere in its depths, the truth about Danny's disappearance waited patiently for someone persistent enough to find it. And Tom had nothing but time. Rebecca Martinez had been a forest ranger for 8 years when she was assigned to the Olympic National Park in the spring of 2018. At 34, she was experienced enough to handle the physical demands of backcountry patrol, but young enough to still feel the thrill of discovery that came with exploring remote areas of the wilderness. She had worked in Yellowstone and Glacier National Park before requesting a transfer to the Pacific Northwest, drawn by the unique ecosystem of the Olympic Peninsula and the challenge of working in one of the most diverse wilderness areas in the country. The Danny Morrison case was part of her briefing when she arrived at the park headquarters. 20 years had passed since the boy's disappearance, and while the case remained technically open, it had long since ceased to be an active investigation. Rebecca learned about Tom Morrison's continuing search efforts, about the group of volunteers who called themselves Danny's Rangers, and about the various theories that had been explored over the years. To her, it was background information, part of the institutional memory that every ranger needed to understand the complex relationship between the Park Service and the communities it served. Rebecca's assignment included regular patrols of the backcountry areas that saw fewer visitors, maintaining trails and monitoring wildlife populations in some of the most remote sections of the park. She enjoyed the solitude of these assignments, the way the forest revealed its secrets to those patient enough to observe without disturbing. Her training had emphasized the importance of noticing details that others might miss: changes in animal behavior, signs of environmental stress, evidence of human impact in areas where it shouldn't exist. It was during one of these routine patrols, on a gray morning in October 2018, that Rebecca made the discovery that would reignite the Danny Morrison case after 20 years of silence. She was working alone in a remote area about 12 miles northeast of Marymere Falls, following an old logging road that had been abandoned decades earlier. The road had been reclaimed by the forest, but traces of it remained visible to someone who knew what to look for. A slightly different spacing between trees, subtle changes in the undergrowth that marked where heavy machinery had once passed. Rebecca was documenting invasive plant species when she noticed something that didn't belong. About 50 yards off the old road, partially hidden beneath a fallen cedar that had probably come down during the previous winter's storms, she glimpsed a flash of faded green fabric. Her first thought was that someone had left camping gear behind, a not uncommon occurrence in the backcountry. But as she approached the site, her trained eye began to pick up details that made her pulse quicken. The fabric was partially buried under years of accumulated forest debris, fallen leaves, moss, small branches, and the slow accumulation of organic matter that the forest used to reclaim anything left unattended. But the color and texture were distinctly artificial, clearly manufactured rather than natural. Rebecca carefully began clearing away the debris, her movements methodical and deliberate. She had found enough evidence of human activity over the years to know the importance of preserving context, of documenting everything exactly as she found it. What emerged from beneath the forest floor was a backpack, faded from exposure, but still recognizably green. The fabric had deteriorated in places, weakened by years of moisture and decomposition, but the basic structure remained intact. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she might have found. She had seen enough photos and heard enough descriptions over the past few months to recognize the possible significance of a green backpack in this particular forest. The backpack was a JanSport, though the brand name was barely visible after 2 decades of weathering. It was positioned in a way that suggested it had been there for a very long time, not recently discarded by a careless hiker. The way the fallen cedar lay across it, the depth of the debris accumulation, the degree of deterioration, everything pointed to this being something that had been hidden in the forest for years. Rebecca's training kicked in immediately. She used her GPS device to mark the exact coordinates of the discovery, then photographed the site from multiple angles before touching anything. She documented the position of the backpack relative to the fallen tree, the depth of debris that had covered it, and the surrounding terrain. Only after she had thoroughly documented the scene did she begin the careful process of excavating the backpack from its forest tomb. The zipper was corroded and required careful manipulation to open without damaging whatever might be inside. Rebecca's hands were steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She knew that if this was indeed Danny Morrison's backpack, its contents might provide the first real clues about what had happened to him 20 years earlier. Inside the main compartment, she found items that had been remarkably well preserved by the waterproof qualities of the backpack's interior. A compass, brass with what appeared to be initials engraved on the back. A field guide to Pacific Northwest wildlife, its pages swollen with moisture, but still largely intact. 3 granola bars, their packaging faded but recognizable, and most significantly a small notebook with a marbled composition book cover. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she opened the notebook. The pages were damp and some had stuck together, but Danny Morrison's name was clearly visible on the inside front cover, written in the careful block letters of a 12-year-old boy. Page after page contained observations about the forest, sketches of animals, notes about plant species, records of weather conditions. The entries were dated, and Rebecca could see that they continued right up until August 15, 1998, the day Danny had disappeared. But it was the final entry that made Rebecca's blood run cold. In handwriting that seemed hurried, almost frantic, Danny had written, "Found the place from my dream. The stones are here just like I saw," following the voices deeper. "Dad will be so excited when I tell him what I found. The compass points to something amazing." Rebecca closed the notebook carefully and sat back on her heels, trying to process what she had discovered. This was undoubtedly Danny Morrison's backpack, but its location raised more questions than it answered. She was 12 miles from where he had last been seen, in an area that had been searched repeatedly over the years. How had the backpack ended up here? And more importantly, where was Danny? The discovery site didn't show any signs of a struggle or accident. There were no human remains in the immediate area, no other personal belongings, no indication of what might have happened to the boy who had carried this backpack into the forest 20 years earlier. The backpack appeared to have been placed rather than dropped, positioned in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. Rebecca spent the rest of the day carefully searching the surrounding area, documenting everything she found. About 30 yards from the backpack location, she discovered what appeared to be the remnants of an old campsite, a fire ring made of stones that had been arranged by human hands, though any evidence of recent use had long since been erased by time and weather. The site was well hidden, tucked into a natural depression that would have been invisible to anyone not looking specifically for it. As evening approached, Rebecca faced a dilemma. She knew she needed to report her discovery immediately, but she also understood the magnitude of what it would mean for Tom Morrison and the many people who had spent years searching for Danny. After 20 years of not knowing, this backpack would provide some answers while simultaneously opening up new mysteries. She used her satellite phone to contact park headquarters, speaking carefully to avoid any details that might be overheard by unauthorized parties. "This is Ranger Martinez on Backcountry Patrol. I need to speak with Supervisor Chen immediately. I've made a discovery that requires immediate attention." Margaret Chen's voice crackled through the static. What kind of discovery, Rebecca? I'd rather not discuss it over the radio. But you're going to want to notify the Sheriff's Department and probably the FBI. This is related to an old missing person case. The silence that followed told Rebecca that Margaret understood exactly what she was talking about. After 20 years, Danny Morrison's case was about to become active again. As Rebecca carefully packed the backpack into an evidence bag, she found herself thinking about the notebook's final entry. What had Danny meant about stones and voices? What place from his dream had he found? And why had his compass pointed him so far from the trail where he had last been seen? The forest around her was growing dark, filled with the sounds of evening settling over the wilderness. Somewhere in these woods, the complete truth about Danny Morrison's disappearance was still waiting to be discovered. But for the first time in 20 years, someone had found a piece of that truth. The search was about to begin again. The call came to Tom Morrison at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in October. He was closing the bookstore, running the daily receipts and preparing for another solitary evening in his apartment, when his phone rang with a number he recognized immediately. Margaret Chen had called him countless times over the years, usually to gently discourage some new search plan or to inform him about access restrictions in certain areas of the park. But something in her voice this time was different. "Tom, I need you to come to park headquarters immediately. We've found something." The drive from Port Angeles to the park headquarters normally took 45 minutes, but Tom made it in 30, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a tension that made his knuckles white. 20 years of dead ends and false hopes had taught him to manage his expectations, but Margaret's tone had carried a weight that he hadn't heard since the early days of the search. Something significant had happened. The headquarters building was unusually busy for evening hours. Tom recognized several vehicles in the parking lot, including ones belonging to the county sheriff's department and what appeared to be federal agents. His heart rate accelerated as he realized that whatever had been found was important enough to bring multiple agencies together on short notice. Margaret met him at the entrance, her face showing the strain of someone who had been making difficult phone calls for the past several hours. She guided him to a conference room where several people were waiting, including Rebecca Martinez, whom Tom had never met, but whose reputation as a thorough and competent ranger had reached him through the Park Service grapevine. "Tom," Margaret said gently, "Ranger Martinez made a discovery today that we believe is connected to Danny's case. I want you to prepare yourself. This is significant, but it's also going to raise new questions that we can't answer yet." Rebecca stepped forward, her demeanor professional but compassionate. "Mr. Morrison, I found your son's backpack this morning during a routine patrol. It was in a remote area about 12 miles northeast of Marymere Falls, well outside the original search perimeter." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. After 20 years of searching, of hoping, of imagining every possible scenario, someone had finally found a piece of Danny. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "The backpack?" he managed to say. "You're sure it's his?" Rebecca nodded and carefully placed an evidence bag on the table. Through the clear plastic, Tom could see the faded green JanSport that he remembered so clearly from that last morning. The sight of it brought back a flood of memories. Danny packing his notebook and granola bars, adjusting the straps for comfort, his excitement about the day's hike. "We found several items inside that confirm the identification," Rebecca continued. "A compass with initials engraved on it, a field guide to Pacific Northwest wildlife, and a notebook with Danny's name inside. The notebook contains entries dated up to August 15, 1998, the day he disappeared." Tom's hands shook as he reached toward the evidence bag, stopping just short of touching it. Can I see the notebook?" FBI Special Agent Patricia Voss, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "We're treating this as an active crime scene, Mr. Morrison. The evidence needs to be processed by our laboratory before we can share detailed information. But I can tell you that the notebook contains what appears to be Danny's final entry, written on the day he disappeared. What does it say? Tom's voice was barely above a whisper. Agent Voss exchanged glances with Margaret before responding. Your son wrote about finding the place from his dream and following voices deeper into the forest. He mentioned stones arranged in some kind of pattern and that his compass was pointing to something amazing. Tom felt the room spinning around him. The words triggered a memory that he had pushed aside for 20 years. Danny's behavior on that last morning, his mention of dreams about the forest, his strange urgency to begin hiking. At the time, Tom had dismissed it as typical preteen enthusiasm, but now it seemed ominous and significant. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who had been contacted as one of Danny's rangers, arrived at the headquarters as the briefing continued. Her anthropological training had made her valuable in analyzing the cultural and historical context of the search area, and her insights had guided several search efforts over the years. The reference to stones arranged in patterns is interesting, she said after being brought up to speed. There are several archaeological sites in the Olympic Peninsula where indigenous peoples created stone circles and other formations for ceremonial purposes. Some of these sites aren't well documented or may have been forgotten over time. James Whitehorse, also contacted because of his knowledge of traditional tribal areas, provided additional context. My grandfather told stories about places in the deep forest where the spirits were especially strong. Some of these places had stone circles that were used for vision quests or coming-of-age ceremonies. Young people would go there seeking guidance or understanding. The revelation that Danny might have been drawn to some kind of ceremonial site added a new dimension to the mystery. It suggested that his disappearance might not have been a simple case of getting lost, but rather a deliberate journey to a specific destination that had somehow called to him. Agent Voss outlined the next steps in the investigation. We're going to expand the search area around where the backpack was found. We're bringing in ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and a full forensic team. We're also going to re-examine all the evidence from the original investigation, looking for connections that might have been missed 20 years ago. Rebecca described the discovery site in detail, explaining how the backpack had been hidden beneath a fallen tree and covered by years of forest debris. The location suggests that either Danny traveled much farther than anyone originally thought, or that the backpack was moved after he disappeared. The positioning didn't look accidental. It seemed to have been placed deliberately. Tom struggled to absorb all the information. After 20 years of questions, he finally had some answers, but they only led to more mysteries. Where was Danny now? What had happened to him after he left his backpack in that remote location? And what was the significance of the stone circles and voices that he had written about in his final journal entry? There's something else, Rebecca added. I found what appears to be an old campsite near the backpack location. It's been there for a long time, possibly years before Danny disappeared. Someone had created a fire ring using stones arranged in a specific pattern. It might be connected to the ceremonial sites that Dr. Hendricks and Mr. Whitehorse mentioned. The possibility that Danny had been drawn to a site that had historical and spiritual significance added weight to James Whitehorse's suggestion that traditional knowledge might be key to understanding what had happened. The tribal elder agreed to guide search teams to similar sites in the area, places that might not appear on any modern maps, but had been important to indigenous peoples for generations. As the meeting concluded, Tom found himself alone with the evidence bag containing Danny's backpack. 20 years of searching had led to this moment, but instead of providing closure, the discovery had opened up new avenues of investigation and new possibilities for hope. His son's voice seemed to speak to him through the faded notebook, across the gulf of years and mystery that separated them. I'm going to find you, Tom whispered to the backpack. I'm going to understand what happened to you, and I'm going to bring you home. The forest had finally yielded one of its secrets, but Tom Morrison understood that the complete truth was still hidden somewhere in its depths, waiting for someone persistent enough to discover it. The expanded search began at dawn 3 days after Rebecca Martinez's discovery. The site had been secured and examined by forensic specialists who documented every detail of the backpack's location and the surrounding area. What they found confirmed Rebecca's initial observations. The backpack had been there for many years, possibly since 1998, but its placement suggested human intention rather than accidental loss. Tom Morrison stood at the edge of the search perimeter, watching teams of specialists work with equipment that hadn't been available during the original investigation 20 years earlier. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the Earth for any anomalies that might indicate buried remains. Cadaver dogs worked in careful patterns, their handlers watching for any sign that the animals had detected the scent of human decomposition. The technology was impressive, but Tom found himself drawn to the more traditional approaches being employed by James Whitehorse and the tribal elders who had joined the search. James had brought 3 other members of the lower Elwha Clallam tribe, men and women who carried knowledge passed down through generations about the sacred sites scattered throughout the Olympic Peninsula. They moved through the forest with a different kind of awareness, reading signs that weren't visible to most outsiders. Their presence had initially made some of the federal agents uncomfortable, but their intimate knowledge of the area had quickly proved invaluable. "This place has been important for a long time," James explained to Tom as they walked through the search area. "My great-grandmother used to tell stories about young people coming here for vision quests, seeking guidance from the spirits of the forest. The stone circles were markers, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin." About a quarter-mile from where Danny's backpack had been found, the search team discovered the first stone circle. It was ancient, probably predating European contact by centuries, but it was unmistakably artificial. Stones had been arranged in a perfect circle about 15 feet in diameter, with larger rocks marking what appeared to be the 4 cardinal directions. Moss and small vegetation had grown over many of the stones, but the pattern was still clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Dr. Hendricks documented the site carefully, noting its construction and orientation. "This confirms the historical and cultural significance of the area," she reported to the search coordination team. "Danny may have discovered this site and been drawn to explore further. For a 12-year-old interested in wilderness and adventure, finding something like this would have been incredibly exciting." The discovery of the stone circle led to the expansion of the search area even further. If Danny had found one ceremonial site, he might have continued looking for others. The tribal elders consulted their collective memory and oral traditions, identifying other locations where similar sites might exist. Some of these places were miles from any marked trail, accessible only to someone willing to push deep into the wilderness. Rebecca Martinez had been assigned to coordinate with the tribal guides, and she found herself learning about the forest from an entirely different perspective. Where her ranger training had taught her to see the forest as a system of habitats and species, the tribal elders saw it as a living entity with spiritual geography that was as real and important as its physical features. "Your son felt the pull of this place," Elder Mary Clearwater told Tom during one of their conversations. "Some children are more sensitive to the old ways, more open to hearing the voices that speak from sacred places. It's not uncommon for young people to be drawn to sites like this, especially when they're dealing with grief or seeking understanding." The reference to grief struck Tom powerfully. Danny had indeed been dealing with the loss of his mother, and their annual hiking trips had become a way of processing that loss together. Perhaps Danny had been more affected by his mother's death than Tom had realized, and perhaps the forest had offered him something that he couldn't find anywhere else. On the 4th day of the expanded search, the team made another significant discovery. About 2 miles from the first stone circle, following what appeared to be an old game trail that was barely visible to modern eyes, they found a second ceremonial site. This one was different. Instead of a simple circle, the stones had been arranged in a more complex pattern, that included smaller circles within the larger one, and what appeared to be pathways connecting different sections. But more importantly, they found evidence of recent use. The area around the stone formation had been cleared of debris, and there were signs that someone had built fires there within the past few decades. Carbon dating of the charcoal remains would provide more precise timing, but the evidence suggested that the site had been visited long after the original indigenous peoples had been displaced from the area. "Someone has been maintaining this place," James observed. "The stones have been repositioned, the pathways kept clear. This isn't just an ancient site, it's been active more recently." Agent Voss coordinated the processing of this new crime scene, but she was careful to work with the tribal elders to ensure that their cultural protocols were respected. The site clearly had spiritual significance that went beyond its potential connection to Danny's disappearance, and the investigation needed to balance the search for evidence with respect for indigenous heritage. The team found additional items near the second stone circle: fragments of modern camping equipment, pieces of metal that might have come from hiking gear, and most significantly, a small piece of fabric that appeared to match the color and texture of Danny's clothing from the day he disappeared. The fabric was tested immediately, and preliminary analysis confirmed that it was consistent with the shirt Danny had been wearing 20 years earlier. Tom stared at the tiny piece of blue fabric as it was sealed in an evidence bag. It was smaller than a postage stamp, worn and faded by years of exposure, but it represented another tangible connection to his son. Danny had been here, at this sacred place deep in the forest, far from any marked trail or known camping area. He was following something, Tom said to Rebecca as they studied the site. The notebook entry mentioned voices and his compass pointing to something amazing. He found these stone circles and kept going, looking for something more. The search expanded again, following the logical progression that Danny might have taken if he had been moving from one ceremonial site to another. The tribal elders identified 3 more potential locations within a reasonable walking distance, places where oral tradition suggested that important spiritual activities had taken place. Dr. Hendricks worked with the tribal guides to understand the significance of the sites they were discovering. "These weren't random locations," she explained to the search team. "They were chosen for specific reasons: proximity to water sources, elevation that provided views of the surrounding area, natural features that had spiritual meaning." If Danny was following some kind of pattern, there might be a logical sequence to the sites he visited. The psychological profile of Danny, that had been developed 20 years earlier, was updated to include his possible attraction to these sacred places. Dr. Reeves, who had flown up from Seattle to assist with the investigation, offered insights into how a grieving 12-year-old might have responded to discovering sites of spiritual significance. "Children often seek meaning and connection when they're dealing with loss," he explained. If Danny stumbled upon these stone circles, he might have seen them as a way to connect with something larger than himself, perhaps even as a way to feel closer to his deceased mother. The notebook entry about voices and dreams suggests that he was experiencing something profound. As the search entered its second week, Tom found himself spending more time with the tribal elders, learning about their understanding of the forest and its spiritual geography. Their perspective offered him a different way of thinking about Danny's disappearance, one that went beyond the purely physical search for remains or evidence. "Your son became part of this place," Elder Clearwater told him one evening as they sat around a campfire near the search base. "Not in the way you fear, but in the way that happens when someone truly connects with the sacred. Sometimes the spirits call young people to them, not to harm them, but to teach them something important." Tom wasn't sure what to make of this interpretation, but he found it strangely comforting. After 20 years of imagining the worst possible scenarios, the idea that Danny might have experienced something transcendent, something meaningful, offered a different kind of hope. The search would continue, following the trail of stone circles and sacred sites deeper into the wilderness. But Tom was beginning to understand that finding Danny might require more than forensic science and search technology. It might require understanding the spiritual landscape that had drawn his son away from the marked trails and into the heart of the forest's most ancient secrets. The third stone circle was discovered on a misty morning in late October, almost exactly 3 weeks after Rebecca Martinez had found Danny's backpack. This site was different from the others, larger, more elaborate, and positioned on a natural promontory that offered commanding views of the surrounding valleys. The stones had been arranged in concentric circles with pathways radiating outward like spokes of a wheel, and the entire formation was oriented to align with the sunrise during the autumn equinox. Tom Morrison stood at the edge of the circle as FBI forensic specialists carefully documented every detail of the site. The morning fog drifted through the ancient trees like spirits made visible, and for a moment he could almost understand what might have drawn Danny to this place. There was something otherworldly about the location, something that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space. James Whitehorse and Elder Mary Clearwater approached the circle with obvious reverence, their movements careful and deliberate. This was clearly a site of major significance, one that had been used for important ceremonies over many generations. The stones showed signs of recent maintenance, carefully repositioned, and the pathways kept clear of debris. "This is a place where young people came to seek visions," Elder Clearwater explained to the assembled search team. "The old stories tell of children who would come here during times of change or loss, hoping to receive guidance from the spirits of their ancestors. Some would stay for days fasting and praying until they received the understanding they sought. Agent Voss coordinated the search of the area around the stone circle, but it was Elder Clearwater who found the most significant discovery. In a small depression at the center of the circle, hidden beneath a carefully arranged pile of stones, she uncovered a shallow cache that had been sealed with pine pitch and covered with bark. Inside the cache, wrapped in what appeared to be pieces of Danny's shirt, were items that told the story of his final days in the forest. There was a small notebook, different from the one found in his backpack, filled with writings and drawings that documented his spiritual journey through the sacred sites. There were personal items, his grandfather's compass now pointing not to magnetic north, but to the center of the stone circle, and a lock of hair that DNA analysis would later confirm belonged to his mother. Most significantly, there was a letter written in Danny's careful handwriting that appeared to be addressed to his father. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means you found the sacred places like I did. I know you're probably scared and angry that I left, but I had to follow the voices. They've been calling to me since Mom died, telling me that she's waiting somewhere special. I found the stone circles like in my dreams, and each one taught me something about letting go of sadness. The spirits here aren't scary. They're kind, and they help people understand things that are too big for regular thinking. I'm going to the place where all the circles point, where Mom is waiting. Don't be sad for me. Tell everyone I found what I was looking for. I love you." Tom's hands shook as Agent Voss read the letter aloud. After 20 years of not knowing, he finally understood what had happened to his son. Danny hadn't been lost or kidnapped or injured in an accident. He had made a conscious choice to follow a spiritual path that had led him away from the physical world and into something that transcended ordinary understanding. The tribal elders weren't surprised by the letter's contents. "Sometimes the spirits call young people home," James explained gently. "Not to the physical home, but to the spiritual home where their loved ones are waiting. It's not death, as you understand it, but a transformation into something larger." Dr. Hendricks studied the notebook that had been found in the cache, documenting Danny's progression through the sacred sites over what appeared to be several days. His final entries described increasingly profound spiritual experiences, visions of his mother, conversations with spirits of the forest, and a growing understanding of his purpose in this sacred landscape. According to his writings, he was following a specific path, Dr. Hendricks reported. Each stone circle provided him with guidance for the next stage of his journey. He wasn't wandering randomly. He was following a spiritual map that led him deeper into the forest's sacred geography. The search team followed the direction that the stones in the final circle pointed toward, leading them higher into the mountains, along paths that existed more in spiritual tradition than physical reality. The terrain became increasingly difficult, requiring technical climbing skills and equipment that a 12-year-old boy couldn't have possessed. It was Rebecca Martinez who suggested the answer that everyone had been avoiding. "What if the final destination isn't a physical place?" she asked during one of their evening briefings. "What if Danny's journey led him to a spiritual transformation that transcended the physical world?" Agent Voss struggled with this interpretation from a law enforcement perspective. "We need to find physical remains," she insisted. "We need concrete evidence of what happened to him." But the tribal elders offered a different perspective. "Your son found what he was looking for," Elder Clearwater told Tom. "He found his mother, he found peace, and he found his place in the larger story of this forest. The spirits don't always leave behind what you call evidence." Tom found himself torn between his need for closure and his growing understanding of what Danny had experienced. The scientific part of his mind wanted physical proof, but the part of him that had spent 20 years walking these trails was beginning to accept that some mysteries couldn't be solved with conventional investigation. The search continued for another week, but no additional physical evidence was found. The forest had revealed its secrets as far as it was willing, and the story of Danny Morrison's disappearance had reached its resolution, even if it wasn't the kind of ending that satisfied everyone involved. At the final briefing, Agent Voss officially closed the case as resolved, though the classification was unusual. "Based on the evidence we've discovered, we believe that Danny Morrison made a conscious decision to leave his family and follow a spiritual path that led him into the deep wilderness. While we haven't recovered physical remains, the evidence suggests that he achieved what he was seeking and found peace in this sacred landscape." Tom Morrison stood at the first stone circle one last time, holding the letter that his son had written 20 years earlier. The forest around him was entering its winter dormancy, preparing for the long months of rain and snow that would soon transform the landscape. But the sacred sites would endure, maintaining their ancient vigil for other young people who might need guidance during times of loss and transformation. "I understand now," Tom said quietly to the forest. "You weren't lost, Danny. You were found." The mystery of Danny Morrison's disappearance was finally resolved, but not in the way anyone had expected. He had found his mother, found peace, and found his place in the eternal cycle of the forest. The stone circles would continue to mark the sacred geography, where a 12-year-old boy had completed a spiritual journey that began with grief and ended with transcendence. Tom Morrison returned to his life in Port Angeles, but he was changed by what he had learned. He continued to visit the stone circles, now as a guardian of their sacred significance, rather than a searcher for his lost son. The forest had taught him that some kinds of love transcend physical presence, and that some journeys lead not to destinations but to understanding. Danny's rangers continued to meet, but their mission evolved from searching for a missing boy to preserving the sacred sites where he had found his purpose. The stone circles became a place of pilgrimage for other families dealing with loss, a reminder that love endures beyond the boundaries of the physical world. In the end, the forest had kept its promise to both father and son. It had provided Danny with the spiritual journey he needed to find peace, and it had taught Tom that love doesn't end with physical separation. The mystery was solved not with evidence and proof, but with understanding and acceptance. The sacred circles continued their ancient vigil, waiting for the next young person who might need guidance during a time of transformation. And somewhere in the eternal green of the Olympic forest, the spirits of a mother and son walked together through seasons that had no end.